In this video, I'll complete the Folio Society style slipcase by covering it, dealing with that pesky curved opening. In the last video, I made the body of the slipcase using an overly complex jig to cut the curves of the opening. Now I need to get a covering material to smoothly fold over these curves. When dealing with something I haven't done before, or even doing something I've done heaps of times but with different materials, I do tests, mock-ups and research. To do some tests, I need some curved pieces of board and covering material. As well as cutting the board, I'll cut some pieces of material I want to cover the slipcase in. And since I'm at it, I want to try some cloth. I could easily imagine I'd like to make more of these using cloth in the future. My favourite cloth is Arborlave, and it happens to not be one of the stretchiest book cloths out there. This is one of the reasons I like it. There used to be a cloth called Duo, which I loved the weird two-colour effect of, but it was stretchy once it got moist, and I didn't like that much. But stretch in this case is useful, so let's try the less stretchy material. The research on this subject is to go back to the article in the December 2023 Guild of Bookworkers newsletter. In her article, Alice Vaughan focuses on turning over the curved opening as one of the key steps. Her approach is to apply PVA or mix to most of the covering material, but to use paste at the edge that will be turned over the edge. The idea is the moisture in the paste will soften the material, letting the material turn in easily or easier. She does caution about using too much paste as it can squeeze out and make a mess. She also says to go slowly. What I don't like about this approach is having to make paste for such a small step. I only use paste for paper repair and covering in leather. Otherwise I use a paste substitute like methyl cellulose. What could I do instead? The key is the moisture. What if I introduced some moisture to the material along the edge but used straight PVA? Of course the Arborlave only accepted a bit of moisture on the back, and the Weibelin grabbed the moisture out of my hand and sucked it down. I may have been a bit heavy-handed with the moisture. Both went over the edge fine and tacked nice and easy, requiring no weight to hold in place. This approach worked at getting the material over the curved edge and then sticking. My concern was about whether the Weibelin would have a tide line after it had dried. We'll check it out later. I did do a test with methyl cellulose instead of starch paste, and I made a mess, and the material kept lifting and I had to weigh it down to get it to dry in place. Putting some weight on a single sheet of test board is fine, but it gets trickier when it's the opening of a slipcase. I didn't like this approach. Covering this slipcase is almost the same as another set of videos I did on covering a slipcase with decorative paper. I wrap around the edges and then cover the sides. Most genuine Folio Society slipcases were covered using a single piece of material cut to a fairly complex shape. I'm sure these were die cut. If you know different, let me know in the comments. The first problem I encountered is that my covering material sheets are not large enough to cut a strip to go all the way around in one go. That's fine, I'll just do it in two pieces. If you need a more detailed narration of how I cover the sides, there's a link to the other video in the description. The summary is that I'll cut the strips wider than needed and draw a line along one side for the edge of the box to line up with. The first piece extends out past the opening and then wraps a small distance onto the back, maybe 10 or 20 millimeters. I use 15 millimeters for all the edges and this overlap. The second piece goes over from the corner, overlapping the first piece, and extends past the front opening too. Once the covering material is attached, I trim all the extensions to 15 millimeters. can now glue the extensions or turn-ins, or whatever you want to call them, onto the sides of the slipcase. First, debulking the corners by folding them in place without glue and cutting through them so I can remove the overlaps. Then it's a simple matter to glue out the flaps and turn them in or over, or whatever you want to call it. To turn in at the head and tail, I'm going to use a hybrid approach. For the end pieces, I'm going to do diagonal nicks across the board edge, but for the sides, I'm going to cut little tongues to sit on the board edges under the end turn-ins. This covering material is a bit thin, and I want an overlap at the corners. It's a bit hard to explain, but I hope the video makes it clear. Finally, it's time to cover the sides. I'm going to have a 3mm border around the edges, so I measure and work out the size of the side covering material. The width is a bit tricky and I just measure it at the top and middle. I cut the side pieces wider than needed, as I'll trim them to width once I cut the curves. I draw a line horizontally through the centre of the material to use when cutting those curves. If you think ahead, you can use the offcut of the board as a template to cut the covering material. I've drawn a faint line on the inside of the covering material along the central horizontal axis, which I line up with the line through the centre of the cutting template. Once I've cut the curve, I can cut to width using the measurements I made a moment ago. I'm sure you're wondering how the experiment from earlier turned out. Is there a tide line? The answer is sort of yes. It's really clear in the video, but in real life it's just noticeable if you look for it. I think it would be acceptable. The cloth is fine. Would it be better or the same if I'd used paste? Paste had other issues too, such as taking ages to tack. What if you just use PVA for everything? The way to find out is to give it a go, and so I did. I'm sure Alice Vaughan had good reason to put in her article to use paste. Maybe the covering material she used required it. Maybe she was playing safe and suggesting an approach she was confident would make all covering materials bend over a curve. But my tests showed that for the material I was using, you didn't need to get overly complex, but you do have to take your time turning the material over the edge. The final step is to attach the sides. To help position the material, I position it and then crease it over the edges at the head and tail. I use these creases to align the material once I've glued it out. Some people call this breaking over. Mr. Matthews mentions this a few times in his book. Once it's dry, I can see how the book fits. The fit is slightly loose as planned. I forgot I was going to insert a couple of pieces of thin mylar inside the end papers to stop acid migration from the acidic cover paper and end papers. I'll try and remember to do this at some point, and this will tighten up the fit. I may also put a mylar wrapper on it to stop it rubbing as the book is taken in and out of the slipcase. I suspect this isn't going to get read a lot. I hope you had some luck acquiring Folio Society book bargains, and if any are missing slipcases, you can now make replacements. Until next time, cheerio!